Well, welcome. Thank you for coming. I've met some of you already. Several were asking what besides Sunday afternoon if you came to the prayer service for unity at the Catholic Student Ministry at UVM, what you've been doing. And it's basically been having coffee and meals and fellowship with about 25 or 30, about half of whom or more are in this room. And it's been just delightful, just delightful. My brother back here asked me, what are three things that have struck you in your time around? And right at the top is that the people I've met with, talked with, and interacted with have a good spirit. A good spirit. It's not a critical spirit, but I think a gentle spirit, but a probing spirit, a questioning spirit, in a good way. And I think that's the spirit that needs to be present for there to be good ecumenism. So thank you for inviting me, Fred and others from the Vermont Council, Ecumenical Council, to be in Vermont. I don't know how many of you are interested in films, filmmaking, the process. As far back as I can remember, to the 1950s, film has fascinated me. I didn't study film formally, but informally, I got into filming. I got into the filmmaking side, the production side, the script side, just how movies are made. And so much has changed in making movies. The technology has massively changed. A few years ago, I had the privilege to actually be in a B-rated sort of Christian film, dramatic film, in which I was actually in a Catholic parish, being a priest ministering to a young man who was a baseball player. If you want to go on Netflix, it's called One Hit From Home. You can actually see me in a dramatic part of it. It is on Netflix streaming, so it's One Hit From Home.
Did the player live?
The guy survived, and he got his faith back, and I helped him. I laid a hand on him and prayed for him. So, Protestant filmmakers, they weren't sure about my collar and the background of the Catholic church I was in. I said, this setting is wonderful. It'll totally confuse any evangelicals who think they're watching a typical baseball movie. But I've always been interested in film. The man whose idea is behind the clips you're going to see tonight, these clips come from almost 3 hours of a documentary. This documentary last year in the 500th anniversary of the Reformation was shown on a number of PBS outlets. Don't think it was shown here in Vermont. But American Public Television bought the rights, and many, like San Diego, Buffalo, many cities aired it, all 3 episodes. You can get the films. Somebody asked me, can you get the films? Yes, I didn't bring any, but you can buy it on Amazon, or you can buy it as a download, even cheaper, which is how people are now buying it through Apple and all those sources, as a download to your phone or your devices. You might want to see the whole. But the man whose idea was behind this is a filmmaker in Pennsylvania who, as an American Baptist minister about 40 years ago, on the front edge of technology and Christians using film, he started trying to produce films. And he began to win some awards for his work. Some of it was historical, some of it was biographical, and then he got into documentary, which is a more recent form, especially popularized through PBS and the great work they've done on documentary films. So he envisioned, before he died a few years ago, a project that at the 500th of the Reformation, we needed a project that would tell the story of the Reformation, that would not be sort of rah-rah for the Protestants or rah-rah for the Catholics, but a real honest Catholic and Protestant interaction with what happened, why it happened, what were the results in culture and Christianity, good and bad. So it wasn't a celebration of the Reformation, but rather a commemoration, which the term I think much better says what we hopefully did last year. Rather than rah-rah, we commemorated a historic moment that was pretty significant. But it ends, the 3rd volume of the 3 films ends the last half hour talking about Christian ecumenism and the future of the divided church becoming more in love with one another and closer together in mission and work together. So what you're going to see in these 14 minutes or so are clips taken from all 3 of these hours. The clips are like a minute to a minute and 20, and there'll be kind of a pause, and it'll go right to the next clip. So you're almost like seeing previews. You're going to see the opening of the whole series, kind of a montage of what it is, and then you'll see some clips taken. And it's kind of jumbled, though it's taken in sequence the way they unfold, not jumbled up. But it's still taken right out of the whole. It's like reading portions of a book and not the whole book. So please understand that you're seeing these portions out of a larger context. The last 3 scenes you'll see are all about the church today, and especially the church in disunity, seeking for more unity together, thus the ecumenical component. So when I was invited to come, we said, well, this is something we could do. We're not in the 500s, but we just passed it. Well, let's end this time of prayer for Christian unity with an event that looks at the Reformation and where we've been and where we are and where we hope and pray we're going. So with no further word, let's watch the film clips and then the panel will respond and the dialogue. Let it begin.
Well, first I'd like to introduce our panelists, so those will be quick. I guess I'll start at the far end and move this way. The Reverend Dr. Arnold Thomas currently serves as pastor of Good Shepherd Lutheran Church in Jericho. He has also served as interim senior pastor of the Charlotte Congregational Church in Charlotte. Dr. Arnold previously served as Minister for Education, Ecumenical, and Interfaith Relations at the Riverside Church in New York City, as Adjunct Professor of Religion at New York Theological Seminary, and as Senior Minister to Wilton Congregational Church in Wilton, Connecticut. He has served a variety of other ministries, including pastor of First Congregational Church in Little Rock, Arkansas, chaplain and member of the faculty of Wesleyan University in Middletown, Connecticut, pastor of First Congregational Church in Williamstown, Massachusetts, and conference minister of the Vermont Conference of the United Church of Christ, the first African-American denominational leader in Vermont. Throughout his ministry, Dr. Thomas has been active in ecumenical and interfaith ministries, having served as co-founder and vice president of the Arkansas Conference of Churches and Synagogues, and as previous president of the Vermont Ecumenical Council. Next, Reverend Nancy Wright has served as pastor of Ascension Lutheran Church in South Burlington since 2006. She also serves as environmental liaison to the New England Synod of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. She has keen interests in the care of sacred waters and has published in the area of Christianity and environmental justice and spirituality and ecology. She was originally ordained in the United Church of Christ and will graduate with a Doctor of Ministry degree from Boston University School of Theology in May 2018. Dr. Jennifer Sisk is Associate Professor of English at the University of Vermont and Director of Graduate Studies in English at UVM. Her area of specialization is literature and religious culture of late medieval England. She's an Episcopalian and an active member of the Cathedral Church of St. Paul in downtown Burlington. Professor Sisk holds an MPhil degree in medieval studies and a PhD in English language and literature, both from Yale University. And Dr. James Byrne is Professor of Religious Studies and Director of the Honors Program at St. Michael's College. He's written 2 books, numerous articles and encyclopedia entries, and teaches classes in his main areas of expertise: the Enlightenment, Science and Religion, Religion in the Context of Modern Thought and Culture, and Theories and Methods in the Study of Religion. Dr. Byrne holds undergraduate and postgraduate degrees in theology from the Gregorian University, Rome, and a PhD in philosophical theology from the University of Dublin Trinity College. Dr. Byrne did postdoctoral work at the University of Tübingen in Germany and has taught at universities in Ireland and the United Kingdom. So please welcome our panel. Now, we really didn't talk about who wanted to go first here, so if somebody wants to volunteer, they feel like they're...
I'll start.
Sure.
That way I can get it over with.
I will. How about this? How my sign is I will stand up and look down.
I'll look for that. Well, I think the first thing Luther did was incite an ecumenical dialogue. It wasn't always pleasant, but it was certainly needed between Catholics and Protestants, and certainly among Catholics. And again, it wasn't always pleasant, but it was still necessary. He also, by his translation of the Bible into the vernacular, incited and encouraged a kind of literacy and learning that would inevitably lead to universal public education. I think that should also be cited as an important contribution that both Luther and in other ways the Reformers provided us. And his actions also encouraged the Counter-Reformation, which allowed Roman Catholics to establish a norm by which its clergy could understand what was accepted among the universal gathering of Catholicism. It took that the Protestant Reformation to really encourage that kind of dialogue, that kind of internal dialogue within the Catholic tradition. One of the things that also impressed me about Martin Luther, given his foibles, he also had this urge to encourage Lutherans, followers of his theology, to translate the liturgy into practice. His expression, the liturgy that followed liturgy, was his sense that the liturgy of worship should be expressed in the liturgy of our lives, how we behave in the world. And he took great emphasis upon, especially within the community of Wittenberg, of trying to establish a social reformation within the lives of that community. I think it was Wittenberg that established the community chest and hired a doctor to serve as a physician for the community itself, thus sort of initiating the start of what we now call socialized medicine or universal care, medical care. His was a process that I think we need to continually analyze of how we translate Christian faith into practice. We live in an age that has difficulty talking about its faith, and for fear of how people of other different faith traditions might respond to us. We need to continually ask ourselves how we can translate our faith into action and promote it in a non-judgmental sort of way that will allow people to say, this is an exciting community that I'd like to learn more about. So that's my start.
Okay.
Sure, well, thank you so much for the film and for this conversation. My one-sentence understanding of Martin Luther is that he illuminated the life of Christ in the context of the challenges of his world. And we are asked to do that, of course, today. And he focused on the dignity of each person, the dignity of each person's faith, and the dignity of each living creature. He talked about the presence of God in every living thing, including even in stones. And so I think within the Lutheran tradition and within really the major world traditions, there's an awareness of the need to illuminate the essence of the religious tradition within the challenges that we face as humanity on this planet. There is a major scholarship going on, I'm sure that you all know, and I'll just mention one, the Catholic scholar Donald Sheed in 2016 wrote The Cosmic Common Good, Religious Grounds for Ecological Ethics, building on Teilhard de Chardin, Father Thomas Berry, and many others who have influenced all of us, speaking about the groaning of our abused creation and the need in this generation while we are still alive to attend to that. And I believe very strongly that that outward approach to the groaning of creation and environmental justice issues will be what draws forward not only Christians to a renewal of our faith, but the major world traditions. You probably are aware of the last 20 years of this movement, the Assisi declarations in 1986, the 5 world religions in Assisi speaking about the core of their religious understanding that care for creation is major in their religions. In 1990, the World Council of Churches in Seoul, Korea, adopted justice, peace, and integrity of creation. And then the so-called Green Patriarch, His All Holiness Bartholomew, Orthodox Patriarch, is now well known for calling pollution a sin. And of course, we're leading up to 2015 Laudato Si, in which Pope Francis said that we need a broader vision of reality, a renewal of humanity, a bold cultural revolution. That's Reformation. And then the Lutherans adopted Eco-Reformation as part of the 500 celebration of the Reformation, saying, our church needs a new Reformation as radical and transformative as the first one in the 16th century. We need to address the signal issue of our time, the restoration of earth, as the 16th century Reformation addressed their signal issue at that time, the salvation of the individual. We need to shift from being human-centered in our understanding of salvation to being earth-centered in a way that seeks the well-being of all earth community. The Lutheran World Federation, then, for Eco-Reformation, said, salvation not for sale, humanity, human beings not for sale, earth not for sale. So the economic dimensions of earth not being for sale, when mostly everything on earth is for sale, is a radical understanding of what it means to be a religious person who believes that creation is a gift of God, and that Jesus Christ, as we know from Colossians and the Gospel of John, is interwoven in creation, actually holds all things together. So within our own area here, there is a watershed resolution urging stewardship of the gift of water that came from the New England Synod of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America a year ago. And then more locally, for example, a local Episcopal church held a symposium on water, an interfaith symposium on water. And another church had a boat ride on Lake Champlain where people representing churches, the synagogue, and the Buddhist Shambhala Center went out on the lake together and understood the health of the lake and actually had a moment of silence with the rain coming down on the boat that was very, very moving to this group of people. So, to conclude, the blend of the mystical and the prophetic, which Luther was, and which so many great leaders within Christianity, of course, are, is what we can adopt today as followers of our great Christian traditions, both Protestant and Catholic. Thank you.
So I'm a scholar of the Middle Ages, as Ray mentioned, and it's very rare, nearly never, that I get asked to comment on Christianity after about the mid 1400s. So I want to thank Fred for inviting me to do this, and maybe even more for trusting me to do this. As I watched the film, many things came into my mind. I was very appreciative of the historical attention. I kind of expected when I started watching it that we would have about maybe 30, it's a 3-hour film, so if you want to watch the whole thing, it's a commitment. I was expecting about 30 minutes of history and then everything else about now, and the ratio was actually the reverse. So we got this really rich account of all of the thinking that has gone into the Protestant Reformation writ large. And that was really wonderful to get to spend some time thinking about, because usually I'm thinking about the early stuff. And the thing that struck me particularly was, even though we are here to talk about Christian unity, and even though we probably all agree that Christian unity is important, I was so moved by the passion of the people with their differences in this film. And it reminded me that all of these thinkers throughout history have felt so powerfully that this matters so much that it's absolutely important to get it right. And we have struggled to do that and to agree upon what that is through the centuries, and we still have our differences. But I think it's a testament to the power of Christianity as a religion that it has spawned as violent as they have been over the centuries. So I'm an appreciator of the tradition and its great legacy to us. I think we can learn a lot from that, and I do think we've come a long way. I mean, especially that clip about Luther and Zwingli just being unable to even shake hands. I think most of us, maybe not all of us, in Christianity today are past that point, and we're better at civil discussion than we once were, and we should certainly celebrate that. So I should confess also that I pretty much everything I know about the ecumenical movement I've learned in the last week watching Catholic Center on Sunday and hearing John preach and having John come and talk to my medieval literature class today, which was probably strange for him, but it was a really great experience for the students. And I've been hoping that tonight I will learn more, and so I want to use this opportunity to raise a question that maybe we can all discuss, which is, what does unity even mean? I don't know. When I hear that phrase, Christian unity, I don't know what it means. And watching the full film, the full 3-hour film, there are a number of people toward the end who comment on to what extent we can agree. I don't even know if unity means the same thing as reconciliation as it is used in relation to Vatican II. I don't know if we mean the same thing by that. So I would like, personally, greater clarity on what our goal is. And I think that could be pretty productive to think about. The other thing I want to share with you is a little bit, well, for me, it's my experience of ecumenism. This is something that I witnessed in the classroom. I'm a professor at UVM, as Ray also said. This is something that happened not in the name of ecumenism, but it was ecumenism on the ground. So I have had the great privilege of teaching a couple of really bright students at UVM, both of whom I happen to know are Christians of different stripes. One of them is a Catholic student who's very active at the Catholic Center and very devout. He was a homeschooled kid, and he always goes to Mass. He's very, very carefully Orthodox. And the other one of these guys is, well, he grew up in one of those alliance churches. He's non-denominational evangelical. So from my perspective, this is about as far apart on the great spectrum of Christianity as you can get. Maybe not the very edges, but pretty close. These guys are very far apart. And I've had them both in Greek classes. And most recently it was in a senior seminar where we had a lot of small group discussions and things. And these two guys found each other. They found each other and they flocked to each other to talk about some of the texts that we were reading. And this was a course on medieval religious and devotional literature, so very Catholic, and some of it quite strange from a Protestant perspective, especially my evangelical student. But these two guys needed each other. They knew about their differences, but they came together and had really respectful and wonderful discussions about how they understood these texts and the differences that were between them and what that might mean. And I thought about that, and it made me wonder, as I watched the film, about the place of youth in the ecumenical movement. Because it really may be that this generation coming up has a perspective that we don't quite share. John was speaking pretty compellingly to my class this morning about the way that they learn and how they have been more influenced by their peers and take more teaching from their peers than his kids, who are in their 40s like I am, or his generation. And this made me wonder, what can we do with young people that can help this conversation?
So I should fess up and say that I'm going to be in Germany in the summer, and I'm thinking of making a little side trip to Wittenberg. So I need some guidance on my allowed safe pilgrimage. Is that okay? But certainly I hope I'm going to do that. Either by temperament or training, I tend to see things in historical context. When I think of Luther, I think of the kind of radical theological and psychological break that he made with some aspects of the medieval church. If you think about the whole idea of purgatory, it was actually a kind of compassionate idea, right? You're not going to go straight to hell, but hey, there's like a little bit of pain and then it's all going to be okay, right? Like the dentist, Put up with it, right? But as we all know, it went horribly wrong, and the church started selling not just the punishment as a remittance for sin, but the actual forgiveness itself. And Luther hated this law because you could never please this angry parental God, right? And then reading St. Paul, there was this big breakthrough: the just person shall live by faith. And this was not simply a theological insight, it was an amazing psychological insight, which Luther expressed in Latin, simul justus et peccator, both a sinner and forgiven. Paul Tillich, the great Protestant theologian, put it really well. He said, you understand that you're accepted even though you continue to be unacceptable. And that was an incredible breakthrough. And it wasn't surprising that this was misunderstood. Luther wrote his small catechism to say to people, hey, listen, you still got to go to church. You still have to do good deeds, right? You can't just, fly to heaven. There's still stuff to be done here on earth. That Nancy was talking about. And so I think if we look at what happened after the Reformation, the political structure in Germany has a lot to do with the divisions of Christian unity. Because, famously Voltaire said the Holy Roman Empire, it wasn't holy, it wasn't Roman, and it wasn't an empire. It was a loose affiliation of German states. And when all of this kind of settled down, the princes decided, well, we'll decide what you're going to be. You're going to be Lutheran or you're going to be Catholic. That was in 1555. And Anabaptists and Calvinists were excluded from that. It took the whole of the terrible 30 Years' War, which Germany and Central Europe were absolutely devastated and destroyed, before the Reformed tradition was included in that. So for me, as a kind of historical theologian, if I go back now, I'm looking in the light of the modern ecumenical movement, and I look at some of the things that were raised at the time, sola fide, sola gratia, all of these were theologically solvable, as we now know in the modern era, I did my postdoc work, I was talking to a couple of people earlier, with Hans Küng, the Catholic theologian, and he wrote a book on justification in 1957, his doctoral thesis. And he basically said, look, the mainstream Protestant doctrine of justification, which he epitomized by Karl Barth, the great Swiss Reformed theologian, and the Council of Trent are basically saying the same thing. And of course he was kind of ignored, because he wasn't the most popular guy in the Vatican in the late 60s. But then it took another 40 years until the Catholic-Lutheran agreement in 1999, where we said, oh my goodness, we understood that we weren't at odds at all once we understand the bigger picture. And this was astonishingly ratified by the World Communion of Reformed Churches in 2017. Isn't that astonishing? It's remarkable. There is no significant difference between the mainstream Christian churches on faith and good works. That's astonishing. It's a remarkable achievement. So a great deal of our differences are attributable to things that are not strictly theological or strictly to do with the church and with ecumenism. And that gives me tremendous hope. A couple of other things that really struck me. Nancy is associated with the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. In 2016, the Catholic Church and the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America came out with 32 statements of agreement. Just a remarkable document. And so I think on a theological level, among the mainstream Christian churches, there isn't very much left to argue about in terms of some of these big issues. Yeah? There are other things. So for example, without being too negative here, one little thing that I disagreed with Bishop Barron, who was talking about the priesthood of all believers, this was a radical idea for Luther, because this cut right through the whole structure of the medieval church. And this definitely has consequences for the type of structure of the church and the sacraments and so on that you would get in the churches subsequent to that. So I think there are real differences, you know. And Jennifer was talking, for example, about unity. There's one model of unity that still has echoes within the Catholic Church, which is this kind of monarchical idea of unity. You know, everybody come back under this big umbrella, Pope's the chief, you know, and so on. You see that, for example, in the document Dominus Jesus, which was written by Cardinal Ratzinger, came out in about 2001, you know. Instead of being separated brethren, Protestants were like wandering sheep and maybe fishing in ecclesiology, you know. I think that's singularly unhelpful. I think it was undone to a great extent by some of the things that Francis has been doing. I'm fortunate to be friends with the Archbishop of Sweden, the Lutheran Archbishop of Sweden, Andrew Jackelin, whom I know through the Science and Religion dialogue, and we happen to share a doctoral advisor. And to see Francis visiting Sweden in a true ecumenical spirit was a remarkable thing for me. Yeah, really a remarkable thing. As a little aside joke, Auntie Jacqueline said to me in a CC a few years ago, she said, you know, all the other Swedish Protestant churches think we're all Catholics because, you know, we were founded by the Anglican Church, or at least we practice the Anglican Church. But I think that was a remarkable gesture. A couple of other things, I think. Let's not forget the Orthodox churches. I think that's really important. I think the structure of authority in the Orthodox churches is definitely a model, even for those churches who don't have an episcopal structure. It's a decentered, you know, as I often say to my students, you know, the Patriarch of Constantinople is not the Pope of the Orthodox churches. You know, he's the first among equals, and so there may be a role for Rome as a center. But when I read, for example, I've been reading recently some theology by some Reformed theologians out of Calvin College. It's just remarkable how much can be achieved when we actually look at what's common among the Christian churches and not what divides us.
Yes.
And so my optimism is based on, you know, as a historical theologian, I can say we have a tremendous amount to learn from history. We can actually achieve a lot in the present by understanding our past. And I think that's really an important element of that. And so I think education is important, you know, to say to people, well, you don't have to get locked into these stereotypical differences. You know, I grew up in Ireland where stereotypical differences and pictures of Catholics and Protestants were writ in stone over hundreds of years, and it's extremely hard to undo, both politically and psychologically. So education, personal meetings, my own experience of going to the Institute for Ecumenical Research as a postdoctoral student in Germany was tremendously helpful, and just the encounter, the personal encounter between people which you were speaking about as well, I think is incredibly important. So I think there's tremendous optimism for the ecumenical movement, and it's thanks to people like John who continue to teach us that there is more in common, I think, among the Christian community than there is that divides us. And for me, history is a great teacher in this regard, and it just shows history can be overcome with insight and with goodwill. The things that divide Christians often had more to do with politics and power structures than they had to do with the theological things at the root of what we thought of the Pope for centuries were the real areas of conflict, which the modern ecumenical movement has shown us is not necessarily the case at all.
Thank you. And on Mace, we had professors and ministers, and pretty much kept it under our time. We could talk. One of the things that I was thinking one way, well, we could, if you'd like to respond to things, but I was going to throw one question out as I was trying to think of some common themes here. And one of the things is, what are those things, what does unity mean? What are the things that we can work together on? And so Nancy talks about the environment and making witness. And you know, these educations where there are these opportunities. And I was thinking about your story of the students. We have a very similar, last semester we had a number of students, very much, you know, Action Alliance, evangelical, and a young Catholic woman who became fast friends. And one thing that strikes me is that one thing that brings Christians together is that we're sometimes in a hostile society.
Yes.
And that's one way, and again, the whole idea of making witness, how can Christians as a groups, and not focus on those doctrinal differences, but focus on living Christ in the world, is they can see that in other people, even though maybe their worship styles and their church structure styles and their theological differences are dramatically different. But against everybody else, they're in common. And that works with interreligious dialogue as well as it does with, So that's the question. How do we reach out to a society that's increasingly hostile, increasingly secular, and I think witness in various areas and education are some good places to have. So I'd love to hear your comments on some of the things.
I'll be very brief because you've already heard some of my comments in the film, but thank you, all of you. I said on the way in tonight to Fred, when we were driving over, I don't know how many of these kinds of events I've done since January of a year ago. I think about 50, in every kind of setting imaginable, more Catholic than Protestant actually in terms of host. I've only had one bad event, the very first one. It was done at Eastern University, which is an evangelical school right next door to Villanova in Philadelphia. And the folks there picked the Catholic who would be my partner, and they picked a Catholic who Catholic who came into the church through the ordinariate. You Catholics will know what that means. And his wife had gone to Wheaton College, which I went to, so it gave me some sense of background, about my age, 60s. The husband had been sort of a bit of a fundamental, very conservative background, but had been Episcopal. And he had left to be an Anglican, and then he left to become a Catholic through the ordinariate. Now I say all of that to say we had a miserable evening. and you're laughing because some of you have a sense of why. Here I am, an erstwhile evangelical, trying to have a conversation with the whole church, and here he is saying, I'm done with all you people, I found a church. So it didn't go all that well. And actually one of the persons on the film that they secured without knowing exactly how they got him was one of the priests who commented a few times you saw. He wrote a book called The Reform of the Reform, which kind of tells you where he's coming from, which is basically he thinks Vatican II was a bomb. He's one of those priests that doesn't like it. If I had to say in the final production, he'd have been cut out. First time I heard a Catholic question Bishop Barron's statement. I agree with you. I also disagree with him about Luther intended for everyone to end up being their own pope. That was not his intention at all. That may have been the intention of Bible fundamentalists later, but that wasn't Luther. He had concerns about how sola scriptura could be abused, but that's not quite fair. But I love Bishop Barron. He's a friend. He wouldn't be on the film if we weren't friends, and I didn't beg him to be on the film. And I knew that he would be recognizable to many Catholics because of his media presence and his being good in front of a camera. But Father Bema, who's our vicar for ecumenism in Chicago, is one of the finest, most articulate Catholic ecumenists in America, probably not known to all of you Catholics who work in this area. But he is, his particular area of expertise is Jewish Christian work. He goes to Jerusalem every January, spends the month there. It's kind of a work with the Institute there of Catholic and Jewish work together. So there's some very interesting people, I'm saying, in the film, and all four of you have contributed wonderfully. I think the question Dr. Sis raised about unity could take evenings to try to answer. In fact, I just came from a meeting in Nashville, Tennessee, invited by a Catholic missionary organization to engage as a consultant to them about what unity is, because it's one of their core values. And they wanted to hear Protestants tell them how we understand the question you asked, so that they can interact with us, because they're doing Catholic work and evangelization in small towns, like in Vermont, but in the deep South, so their near neighbors are a bunch of Baptists and fundamentalists. So they're trying to love their neighbors, carry on ecumenical concord and discourse and partnership in the community, and yet plant Catholic ministry. It's called the Glenmary Mission. And I had a wonderful time with it. They have this core DNA from Vatican II on about ecumenism that I didn't know was a part of their, unique part of their mission. And so they were saying to us, help us understand the other side, our partners we're trying to talk to. And the thing that took the most of our time was trying to answer the question you asked. What is unity? So I'm not even going to try except to say the film uses the words unity, not union. And yet if you ask me, what is the desirable end goal of efforts for unity? I would say ultimately, I would hope that it might be the possibility somewhere down the road of efforts at Christian union. But those are two different questions as I understand them. They're interrelated, they're interconnected. We're not to union of churches in communions and in complete agreement and concord, but we've made incredibly huge steps in that direction within Protestant churches. I, for example, am an ordained Reformed church minister serving alongside of a pastor in the ELCA church because of one of those agreements. He's a pastor of a Lutheran church who's a UCC pastor. Those things wouldn't have happened 20, 25 years ago. So we all three have the experience of that union sort of agreement between our denominations. Those are steps forward. I believe we're going to see more of them. Some of you know that the Pope, coming back from Latin America, is engaging the very question of how to get priests into the Amazonian region so that Catholics can have the Eucharist and not once a year. And so there's on the table at least the possibility of saying a mature man who's married but older, mature, wise, and has proven his faithfulness could be ordained so that you could have a sacramental ministry of the Mass, right? That's actually being discussed. That would scandalize one of those priests on the video, but I think it's not revolutionary for revolution's sake. It's pastoral for the sake of mission and unity's sake, right? So I think those are the things that will drive us into the future. And I'll finish with this. The younger generation, students like Dr. Sisk in her class that I spoke to today, many non-Christians, some Christians in the class. But the sense I get from St. Michael's, my class yesterday, where's David? David's here, right here. I did 2 of his classes on history of Christianity, interaction with students of both campuses. This generation, some of you know this, you're professors and academics, some of you know it instinctively, you have children and grandchildren, so you know it from them. But this next generation is far less church. But secondly, if they're ever going to come back to anything like the church, it might not be like your church or mine. But it certainly won't be a fractured church that wants to put up walls and keep itself from other people. That much I know for sure. They're going to be drawn to something that brings them together. We're now making a project, the same filmmakers, and our ministry has signed the agreement. We're getting some of the seed money, and we're hoping to raise more money, and I've never done this in my life. I often talk to Jack about fundraising. Maybe in retirement you can help me raise a couple $100,000, Jack, to finish a project on the story of Christian unity in 4 25-minute films with study guides and resources can be used across denominations and even on PBS. That's our dream. I've had this dream for about 8 years, and it's actually coming to fruition. We hope to interview Pope Francis in April. We hope to get Tom Wright. We hope to get Justin Welby and Royden Williams. We hope to go to Ireland and interview some people in Belfast that have worked for peace. But this scene I've seen in the first stuff we filmed, the first year of 2 years of filming, and it's a picture of the floodwaters in Houston. And the ecumenical officer for the Houston Galveston Diocese, Catholic Diocese, says you hear her voice as you see the floodwaters and the damage. She said, when the floods hit Houston, nobody said when they started pitching in, are you Catholic or are you Protestant? They just said, come help. And so there is that sense, as Jennifer has said, from her 2 students, you know, as they get to know each other. How can we help? How can we serve? How can we care for the environment? How can we care for these things that really matter? I think that's going to push us more. Now, the danger will be that we just don't care about any kind of truth claim whatsoever. And I think that your 2 students illustrate the truth of that too. They do care about their truth claims and they're living it, but they're being drawn together. So the idea that if you have conviction drives you further apart, I found not to be true at all. I found that young people with some level of growing conviction about their faith and their faith form and expression actually want to be together rather than apart. I think that's a huge difference, and that's been going on in the last, say, 20 years. So I'll stop. I've said enough. More from the panel, and then questions, please, from the audience.
3 points I want to make in response to Jennifer's question. When you ask, what does unity mean? I think the response to that question is different now than it was, let's say, 50 years ago. Because the participants involved in the dialogue are very much different than they were 50 years ago. New York Theological Seminary sponsored a conference at Princeton Theological Seminary that invited conservatives and progressive Christians to come together and talk about the things that we held in common. we talked about our differences, but it was important to talk about the things that we held in common because the makeup of the gathering was now made up of individuals that often antagonize and provided tension for different camps. In that conference, you had gay and lesbian clergy, you had women clergy, you had black and Latino clergy mixing in with white males. 50 years ago, the conversation was mostly among white males. This time, it's a totally different dynamic, a totally different structure, and as a result, a totally different perspective on what it means to be a unified Christian body. And I think those contributions are very vital to the discussion and also to the answer. I continually refer back to the passage where Jesus says, in God's house are many rooms, and I go to prepare a place for you. It's important that people who often feel marginalized within our faith need to find a place and a space that is significantly important for them, that has been prepared for them so that they can feel as if they're making an important contribution to the dialogue of what it means to be Christian and unity and unified. I'll throw it out there.
And I've wondered, I've tried to understand what this is, but I sense that this generation coming up, maybe it has something to do with how connected they are to their peers. Maybe it has to do with the fact that we live in an increasingly secular society, so that those who do grow up with a faith tradition feel a little bit marginalized already. But there is a deep curiosity to understand people with different viewpoints, and also a respect that I think back to my own childhood, and I think we were all a little bit ghettoized. I mean, I was a mainline Protestant, and I had evangelical friends, I had Catholic friends, and we were kind of encamped in certain ways. And I feel like there's much more of the sort of openness that you experienced in your class. And that gives me a lot of hope. I don't know what to do with it. I want to be able to work that and make something happen because of it, and I don't know how. But it is something that I witness and that I find hope in.
A brief comment on secular society, and so a couple of people mentioned secular society and the hostility towards religion within secular society. I think this is a double-edged sword. Some of it has been good and some bad. So for example, I think the free exercise clause in 1791, I see that myself, I don't know if I'm right, but I see that as a secular achievement, perhaps based on mistaken premises that religions always cause wars, with Jefferson and others looking back towards the European experience. And Jefferson says, the only way to solve disputes in religion is to take no notice of them. And so the secular state becomes neutral in this context, right? I think that can only be a good thing, not having, say, an established church in the United States. I think people like that idea. It seems to have worked reasonably well. But on the other hand, I think that we are living through, Nick has left now, he was talking about this hermeneutics of suspicion from Paul Ricoeur. And I think we're living through an era where, and I've done some work on the Enlightenment, where really many of the ideals of the modern world that are expressed in the language of rights and justice and equality and so on, have been divorced from their roots in Christianity in what we could call what one secular philosopher called the prophetic, the Hebrew Bible's ethic of justice and the Christian ethic of love. When they're divorced from that metaphysical and theological roots, they're groundless.
Yes.
And I think that rhetoric is beginning to fall apart myself. I'm not making a prophecy here, I just don't think it's sustainable without some connection to its metaphysical and theological grounding. I think it's absolutely unsustainable. And it's been divorced from those roots, but it's free-floating. And so I think that secular society itself will begin to turn its own hermeneutic suspicion on some of these things that it's taken for granted, that it was actually gotten from the theological tradition. The philosopher who said that was actually an atheist German philosopher called Jürgen Habermas, who said you really have the Christian Jewish tradition in the West. Everything else is postmodern babble. This was his exact quote. And so I think that there are certainly opportunities there to re-engage with secular society, not simply in the way that that we've seen, for example, the science and religion kind of fundamentalism coming from scientific fundamentalism.
With your philosophy, with epistemic humility. In other words, if
Yeah.
we engage with secularism, we must not do it with this, but rather with an epistemic openness to it.
I think what he did, and what many people have done, is to turn the same spotlight of critique on the assumptions of secular modernity that are so easily have been turned on religion.
Right.
And then it may not stand up to the scrutiny
Yeah.
that it has not offered to itself,
Yeah.
at least the last couple of years.
That's fine.
I think one of the issues that we have to look at is faith communities looking at each other as competitors in some kind of a cosmic sport, and that they could not work together because they had to win. And I think if we don't start modeling humble engagement and get rid of our ego, our collective ego, we're not going to reach these people. And I really get kind of angry when people talk about Vermont being the least churched state in the Union. When I see these young people who may not identify with a church, but are more spiritually attuned and prayerful in their own way than a lot of us who've been raised to compete with each other. You know, growing up and saying you could not go to the Methodist Church or something because, you know, they're the enemy, or it's another team. We've got to get rid of that competing team thing if we're going to make any difference. And young people aren't stupid, and they're very observant, and they see how we continue to shoot ourselves in our foot by fighting with each other. I'm a great fan of Richard Rohr, and Richard Rohr talks about, non-dualism in spirituality and mysticism, which is going to be what has to overcome all of the garbage that we've created.
So, yes.
Professor, you mentioned, starting the questioning about the role of our hostile society and maybe calling forth a Christian unity in a different way. I'm wondering if it's even more intense than that the hostile society is actually holding up a shocking mirror to Christians and saying, look at yourselves, and your polarization is mirrored in the violence of our culture. And most of my career as a high school teacher, I've seen the children you mentioned, the millennials, for instance, who kind of identify religion as the source of some of that polarization. And I think that presents a very intense challenge to us as ministers. I know in my own sons and daughters, it's very difficult, to kind of bring them into a tradition of faith that really they say is welcoming and inclusive, and not part of this crunching culture that's trying to, to rip each other apart.
One of the scenes that's very striking in the movie is just how missionaries, right, and people are mystified by these three different groups coming in and saying, are you going to be a Catholic? That kind of perception when they look at it and say, you talk about love one another, and then you're these competitors, like Tom mentioned, and I think there is that. It's hard to, as faculty, we struggle with this all the time. Jim, we've often had the conversation about how things changed after 9/11 in the classroom as far as students looked at religion. Mm-hmm. And I'm a Catholic school kid, and I know what was going on in the Catholic schools. Religion is the problem, not the solution.
I'd like to share, I feel so fortunate having attended Union Theological Seminary in Manhattan. And right across the street is Corpus Christi, where Thomas Merton was baptized. Mm-hmm. And of course, the great Johannine scholar Raymond Brown taught at Union, and he was the first Roman Catholic scholar at Union. So right there was a really so ecumenical with Jewish Theological Seminary across the street. And I began to attend Corpus Christi because I just felt like I wanted to kneel. I was a Congregationalist. I was ordained at Riverside Church in the United Church of Christ. but I wanted to kneel. And I started to go to Corpus Christi, and that's where Monsignor Malsberg and other scholars from Dunwoody Seminary, who then ended up writing the Anchor Bible series, would preach. And we would hear about the great Christian mystics. So it really offered me a spirituality that was rare at Union Theological Seminary, which was so biblically based and so on. And I'm so grateful when I started, I was already ordained, and I asked Monsignor Malsberg, I said, I really am drawn to be here. He said, it's fine, you can come, you can take the Eucharist. And I said, should I become Roman Catholic? And he said, but you're ordained. And there was that real respect for my ordination, but of course I never wore my collar. I didn't want to offend anyone when I attended. And that was just, I just feel so grateful for that.
Amen.
And then lived in a Roman Catholic convent in Seattle when I was working at Earth Ministry. So I just met the best Roman Catholic scholars, nuns, priests. It's just so moving to be in an ecumenical setting where people are sharing biblical scholarship and spirituality, and so welcoming.
Wonderful.
We had a question. Yes.
Yes, I want to thank you as a panel. Really appreciate both the diversity of the 2 women, 2 men. How do we deal with the fear factor? Leadership, fellowship, how do we deal with the fear factor? You know, as you're talking and as we're sharing, I'm reminded of that prayer that many of us heard growing up over the years. God, help us to do the things we should, to be to others kind and good. In everything we do, at work or play, to grow more loving every day.
Amen.
Now, I came straight here from UVM, where their MLK speaker was Dr. Mark Lamont Hill. And one of the things he pointed out was the Nobel laureate, Reverend and Baptist minister, Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., spoke to love and unity. But he was considered an enemy of the state. The fact is, some of us may remember that his own alma mater, Morehouse, did not invite him as a speaker because they considered him too radical, a troublemaker. We are what the Bible says we are dirt. Come from dirt, we'll go back to dirt. But from that womb to the tomb, we don't have to be dirty. And Dr. King was reminding us that too many of us are dirty, especially as he spoke to militarism, poverty, and racism. All are sins. And what we do is compartmentalize these titles. It sort of oozes forth a level of comfort that keeps us from confronting what it is, just raw sin. Someone said something about politics getting in the way of reality of our walk and our journey. So back to the unity thing. Because we can't get out of this alive, can we? If so, see me afterwards. I want to drink. So as we march as this one family on earth, in God's universe, how do we get beyond the fear factor? I think, if my scripture is right, fear is of the devil or Satan. It's not of the spirit and the love factor. So how do we acknowledge it, front and center, then begin to address it in ways that somebody here said, there's another group, they're looking for the answer. They want the food, the spiritual stuff. And many of us were in position to deliver. They don't come back to Mass, they don't come back to the gospel singing in the church, they don't have anything to do with me, you, us. So how do we get beyond that? Because God has called us, has anointed us, has appointed us. All is possible with God. So how do we get rid of that demonic factor? Help!
It's a good place to.
Yeah, I mean, one comment that I think about this all the time, you realize that when our students walk into a classes, and again, and I ask them, they don't say Reverend King anymore. It's Dr. Martin Luther King, and I ask them what his doctorate was in. They have no idea. They don't know he's a minister. So we always read Letter from a Birmingham Jail as part of that first class, and it's great. It's great because everybody we've read earlier in the semester, he's quoting and pointing to like, this is coming from this is a statement of Christian witness. It's not, and we talk about education and that those voices, even the Christian voices, they don't know are Christian voices. Now, why that is, if it's how it gets filtered in the public schools maybe, or what it is, because we don't want to talk about that religious stuff. That's an interesting piece. But
I think Thomas Merton's instructive here, because Nancy mentioned Thomas Merton. When Merton was a young monk, he was like uber Catholic, right? His autobiography and all the terrible things to say about the Episcopal Church on Long Island that his family were associated with and so on. But he changed and he learned, and he became open to new experiences. And to a great extent, he became open to new experiences through his reading, but also through the young monks who were coming into the monastery, many of whom had served in World War II, who brought in new knowledge for him, new experiences, and this opened him up to the world. He transformed in the late 1950s into somebody who had cut himself off from the world, into somebody who began to understand and embrace the world. I was speaking earlier about secular culture. I think that the churches have done a lot of damage to themselves. For example, the Catholic tradition has been really harmed by the sexual abuse scandal. Absolutely no doubt whatsoever about that. Very, very badly damaged by that. But what Merton did was, when his superior said to him, "You can't write about peace and war, you're a monk, shut up." And he'd go, "Well, I'm just saying what the Pope said in Pacem in Terris in 1963, why can't I write that, right?" And so he kept on going. Openness to experience, openness to new encounters with people, all the way through the anti-war movement, the ecumenical movement, and interreligious dialogue. And he stuck to his guns because he knew that he was in the right. And I find tremendous admiration for him in that. He was a pathbreaker like Dr. King was, in so many ways, in not giving in to negativity or to even authority that tried to stop him. And I think Merton's a good model for us, as is Dr. King. And I totally accept what Ray said. He said it many times. You would never know that Martin Luther King was a Christian minister in the way that he's presented. And I think Merton's another great example. His dialogue with the Dalai Lama, what did he talk about? Dogma? No, he talked about experience and spiritual practice. I think those are some of the ways forward. We have some models there, I think.
Yeah, and I think some of the people who are now dying around the environmental justice struggle, either people who are leaders in that, rubber tappers and so on, people who are talking about Dr. Martin King's The Arc of History is Long and It Bends Toward Justice, are trying to decipher within that what hope means and what hope is realistic in relation to the human abuse of the environment with something like climate change, which has many ramifications that none of humanity knows about. So we may have started something that has its own laws of unfolding. Does the arc of history bend toward justice? How does one position oneself in that? Seems to me to be a decision that every person who's on the front line of some kind of resistance decides.